Okay, so why don't we get started? Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second session in our six-part series. It started off great. I'm sure this is going to be another great session. I'm Michael Bellicosa. I'm the head of adult programming at Wilton Library. If you're a jazz fan, I'm also the curator of the Brubeck Collection, one of the largest jazz archives in the world, which we actually have at Wilton Library. So call me if you'd like to come over for a visit. As again, I say it every time, thanks to the Quigley family, these literary programs and series are made possible from the generosity of the literary series in memory of Amy Quigley. We all know Mark, so I'm going to skip the intro, and we got a lot to cover, so I'm going to turn it over to him, and we will proceed. Mark.
Right. As always, thank you, Michael. Thank you all for coming. And you remember last time Michael made the point that I will be more interactive in this session, and I'll be as good as my word. So I'm going to talk for 10 or 15 minutes about the Holy Grail in the context of the whole poem. My aim in teaching, unless I'm confined by what I'm teaching or where I'm teaching, is always to teach a work of literature as a work of art and as a cultural document. So I do want to give you a sense of the flavor of this as a poem. I want to point out details, only a few of the many that I could, of where he differs from Malory. I can't give that a whole lot of time in 6 hours on half of Idylls because there's too much of Tennyson to cover. But I'll remind you that I said last time that the great value in Malory is that civilization is something that Arthur in the myth brought to Britain. You know, in the 6th or 5th century, there were no suits of armor. Weapons were very modest. There was nothing like a Camelot. There was nothing like a round table. There were barely tables in the 5th century. The Arthur who was probably, not certainly, but probably an historical figure who helped protect Britain from the onslaught of the Anglo-Saxons was probably a tribal leader whose court was a mountaintop or a cave or a series of hills. And if he was able to conquer his neighbors, then there would be a chain of connected hills. We're talking about the 6th century when he lived. By contrast, the 15th century, 1485, is when Morte d'Arthur is published. Malory is trying to get the many strains of the legend down into one story with a beginning, middle, and end. He's doing that to create a national myth for Britain out of largely French materials. And because of that, he is very interested in arguing for the court, for civilization, for the idea, as I mentioned, anti-savage, anti-heathen, anti-wilderness. There are lots of references to the wild, the wilderness, the waste in the Holy Grail. The passage they move through is uncivilized. So I made that point last time. I also said that the trajectory of the entire poem is towards the death of Arthur, Morte d'Arthur, the fall of Camelot. The passing of the coming of Arthur makes reference to the fact that Arthur's creation, Arthur and his knighthood for a space were all one will. So you know very early on, that's about 500 lines into the poem, that this is only going to last for a time. Only the second idyll, we didn't do the first 6, remember? Garrett and Lynette has a truly happy ending. The biggest confusion is whether he married this sister or that sister. And from then on, everything turns dark, and the darkness is because of Guinevere and Lancelot. In the marriage of Geraint and Enid is how it's actually pronounced, the fact that he has learned that the queen is unfaithful makes him suspect his wife. And then that's the 3rd and 4th idylls. The 5th idyll, Balin and Balan, when one of the knights tells Balin that the worship he has of the queen cloaks a secret shame, it maddens him. It actually makes him go out savagely and revert to his previously depressive state. And a similar thing happens in the sixth book, the last of the books we didn't read before going to Lancelot and Elaine, Merlin and Vivian. Vivian seduces Merlin. She wants to get a charm from him that will make her freeze anybody in a kind of comatose state. And when she learns about the queen's infidelity, she goes into Camelot to spread that rumor around. She does get the charm. She does freeze Merlin inside an oak tree. And another example of the infidelity of the queen and Arthur's chief knight as poisoning the whole kingdom. I said also that another factor when I was giving the introductory last time was the Holy Grail quest itself. And here's a place where there are significant differences between Malory and Tennyson, although Tennyson follows Malory in the passages about the Grail. He is wholly inventive about almost everything else that happened. So Percival was the original hero and is often associated with the Grail mixed Parsifal. Galahad is promoted to that role by Tennyson. Galahad, in some versions of the myth, is Lancelot's son. Also, he pitches the whole idyll as a dialogue between Percival and a monk named Ambrosius. That monk Ambrosius is also Tennyson's creation, and it turns the idyll not only into a narrative rather than an action-packed, everything we hear is being told, but it's a dialogue between a monk and a knight. And what better colloquy when what's at hand is a holy relic, the cup or plate, saucer, it's probably more like a saucer, that Jesus used at the Last Supper purportedly. Why not have a monk be part of that conversation? But the quest for it is a chivalric ideal. It's something for a knight. And so these two men of very different walks of life are not debating the issue. They're talking about what happened. And we know from the very beginning that Percival ended his life by becoming essentially a monk. And here I want to show you another example. So that's all different from Malory, completely different. But there are some fine touches that are different too. So here's the first stanza of the Holy Grail in Idylls of the King. I use this Penguin edition, but any edition is fine. It's the first 6 or 7 lines. I'm going to read it now. From noiseful arms and acts of prowess done in tournament or tilt, Sir Percival, whom Arthur and his knighthood called the Pure, that's also Tennyson's invention, no one ever called him the Pure, had passed into the silent life of prayer, praise, fast, and alms. So he's moved from noiseful arms and acts of prowess into the silent life of prayer. That's how he's going to end his life. And leaving for the cowl the helmet in an abbey far away from Camelot, there, and not long after, died. So we know at the beginning of the idyll how Percival ends, and he ends not as a knight, but essentially as a monk in an abbey. Here's that same passage from Malory, and I'll read them both again to make the point. And you see why I can't do this a dozen times in every session, because it's too time-consuming. But here's what Malory wrote. Thus 1 year and 2 months lived Sir Percival in the hermitage, a full and holy life, and then passed out of the world, period. 1 year and 2 months lived Sir Percival in the hermitage, a full and holy life, and then passed out of the world. So he gives you the length of time because he's trying to give his document, Mort d'Arthur, something of the texture of history, but it is bland. What Tennyson does is include that leaving for the cowl, the helmet, that transfer, that exchange makes it poetry. he left his helmet in exchange for the cowl. And that detail, those two objects, symbols a kind of synecdoche, part for the whole. He left for the cowl, the helmet, in an abbey far away from Camelot, there, and not long after died. It has a kind of power and beauty. I want to say again, I encourage you to read the poem, The Idylls, out loud. So what happens in the Holy Grail, and I'll end soon for comments, especially if your comments are not only about this idol, but what I'm talking about, is that Arthur has gone out to help a young woman who's come into the court outraged, not angry, violated. And he goes out to get rid of the wild bees, metaphorically, that have done this to her. And so he's not at the round table when Galahad sits in the siege, perilous siege for seat. And when he does, some clouded vision occurs. The knights see it, there's thunder, there's blast, there's a beam. It's transformative. No one's sure what they see or what they don't. And they decide everyone's going to swear an oath to follow this thing wherever it goes so they can see it completely. Arthur comes back and says essentially, what the hell were you thinking? In Malory, Arthur is there. He's not only there, he's grateful to Jesus for sending them this supernatural event. What Tennyson does is he makes Arthur absent because Arthur is too busy being king. And he implicitly and then explicitly scolds the knights by saying, you shouldn't be going all over the wilderness, that's the word he uses, winding up in a quagmire after some dream. You're supposed to be here, but you've sworn an oath. I can't undo that, and we'll just have to live with it. That's because Tennyson is interested in making the point about the moral obligation of all people, especially Victorian Christians, who's the audience he's writing for. We remember that Alfred Lord Tennyson, that Lord is not his middle name. He is a baron, Tennyson is, and he writes from the point of view of the upper class. And one of his goals in Idylls of the King is to suggest that the Camelot of England, the acme of Western civilization in the 19th century, will rot from within if it doesn't take a lesson from Idylls of the King, from the Arthurian material. That's where we're headed as well. Malory has no interest in that. Remember, he's writing hundreds of years before. Malory is trying to create a national myth for a country that is on the brink of the Renaissance. Tennyson is trying to write a cautionary tale for a country that may be on the brink of destruction. There was a lot of worry that the end of the 19th century would be the end of civilization, the millennial worry that at the end of centuries, everything's going to go to hell. So that little change that Arthur's present in Malory, but not present in Tennyson, that change of the bland, he lived and then he died, to he exchanged his helmet for a cowl. Those are the kind of touches that Tennyson gives you that makes poetry. Besides the beauty of the verse, the metaphors, if you read it out loud, he's probably the most musical poet in English literary history. He was mocked when literature got tougher. People like Matthew Arnold had no patience for Tennyson because he was taught in the public schools, that is the schools for public life, what we would call private schools. And because he was sentimental and beautiful in his poetry, he got the nickname Alfred Lawn Tennyson, lawn tennis, someone who was kind of rarefied and elite and effete. James Joyce gives Tennyson some grief in Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. And of course, Monty Python in their movie and Spamalot go to town on Tennyson. I hope we're seeing him in different eyes. So I'll take a pause there one of the things that erodes Camelot is the affair. We've covered that quite a bit. Another is the Holy Grail that we're looking at tonight, because they are abdicating their responsibility to the kingdom, to the king, to the round table, to the fellowship. And the third one is about Arthur's own nature, which we'll come to later in the session. So we'll take a pause, and I invite questions through Michael.
Okay, folks, as usual, we'll use the Q&A button at the bottom, and feel free to put anything in there. We'll take a look and pass it along. I was just wondering, in the meantime, Mark, your comment about Monty Python, is it that they used his version of the story and made fun of it, or did they make fun of his actual language usage?
Well, they're brilliant parodists who went to good English schools where Tennyson would have been on the agenda. So part of what they're doing is they're having fun with a kind of sacred cow. It's not so much that they're using his language. It's just that if 20th century English comedians are going to write something about Arthur, it's going to be Tennyson's Arthur, even if he's not quoting anything. It's just the nature of what they learned in school.
Got it.
Yeah. The idea in Monty Python that a man has had his arms and legs severed and is still hopping around saying to his enemy, have at you, bring it on. The absurd courage of a man with no limbs battling still, and other nonsensical things. You don't have a horse? Get some coconuts.
Right. Any comments, folks?
Okay, so then let me turn to wanting to give you an appreciation of how often there is a kind of echoing, a consonance, which is the repetition of a consonant sound, or the assonance, repetition of a vowel sound, in this poem, even though it's blank verse, that is to say, unrhymed iambic pentameter. And the rhyme is avoided because it's meant to be narrative, epic, and sometimes philosophical and meditative verse. And rhyme will get in the way of that by seeming too sing-songy. So there can be interior rhyme, but most commonly there are repetitions of consonants and vowels. And Arthur in this book, lines 260 to 261, when he's returning from being away on that mission that he'd taken upon himself, where he's being kingly when everyone else is abandoning. He says, and if you're following in any version of the Holy Grail, this picks up about 257. There's a break in the text after the word Excalibur. So to this hall full quickly rode the king, in horror lest the work by Merlin wrought, that is, Camelot itself, was built as a dream, built to music, dreamlike, should on the sudden vanish, wrapped in unremorseful folds of rolling fire. So he's gone away doing his kingly duties. He comes back and he has a terrible foreboding. He quickly comes in horror lest the work by Merlin wrought, that is Camelot itself, dreamlike, should on the sudden vanish, wrapped in unremorseful folds of rolling fire. Well, there's a beauty to that line, but there's also a logic. Remorseful folds are R and F sounds, followed by rolling fire, R and F sounds, in pairings. Remorseful folds, rolling fires. It's not a rhyme in the sense of full rhyme, but since a rhyme is an echo, it is a kind of echo. And there's actually a name, a Welsh name, for that figure of speech where you take two vowels, two consonants, and you pair them and then you repeat them. There's a beautiful poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins called As Kingfishers Catch Fire, Dragonflies Draw Flame. So the world of the very Catholic nature poet, late 19th century, early 20th century, Gerard Manley Hopkins, who mainly wrote in secret because he was afraid that as a Catholic priest, it was sinful to promote his talent. He sees the world charged by light reflected off of the bird or the insect. And so he says, as kingfishers catch fire, ka, fa, ka, fa, the K sound and the F sign, dragonflies draw flame, the DR, dragon, draw, and the F, flies and flame. It's intentional, but it's subtle because we look for rhyme typically at the end of lines, at the end of words, and instead he's foregrounding it. This, what I just read to you about the remorseful fire, it's one example of many that add a kind of tension. Think of Arthur as an actual human being coming back and having this foreboding that it's all going to be for naught, and imagining it going up in a kind of conflagration. And of course, as we go through each of the successive idols for the rest of this series, the remaining 4, it only gets darker and darker. I'll preview that a little bit. But you know, when you look ahead, that the last tournament is not a very encouraging title. The passing of Arthur speaks for itself. So I just want to call attention to the way some of the language works. I also want to show you that when Percival and others go into the wilderness, and the first thing that Arthur says to them when he is unhappy that they made this vow, he says around line 287, "Lo now," said Arthur, "have you seen a cloud?" He's mocking them because they haven't seen the thing itself. It's been covered by some kind of cloth of white samite, which is very popular apparently in the age. And he says, "What go you into the wilderness to see?" There's that word, wilderness. Now, Jesus and John the Baptist went into the wilderness to put the cares of the world behind them and to meditate, and in some cases to do penance. Arthur has built a civilization, a kingdom, and the wilderness is the opposite of that. And he has gone off earlier, metaphorically, to rid the kingdom of the wild bees, these marauders. He says at line 315, 314, "Go, since your vows are sacred being made, yet, for you know the cries of all my realm pass through this hall." That is, people come pleading for help all the time. Ye know the cries of all my realm pass through this hall. How often? Oh, my knights, your places being vacant at my side, this chance of noble deeds will come and go unchallenged. That is, no one will pick up the challenge to defend the people in the kingdom, while ye follow wandering fires lost in the quagmire. Before quagmire was a metaphor, it was really a kind of wild bog that would slow you down or swallow you up. Many of you, yea, most, return no more. Ye think I show myself too dark a prophet? Come now, let us meet. And he moves on. But he's right in what he imagines. He's right in imagining that this is the beginning of the end. And as they travel towards the quagmire, there's repetition of the phrase, a land of sand and thorns. That is a wilderness, a land of sand and thorns. And what is a land of sand and thorns? Well, it's impossible in England to hear a reference to sand in the context of the Holy Grail and not think of the Holy Land. And it's impossible in such a poem to see a reference to thorns and not think of the crucifixion. But it's not a holy reference. It's a reference of desolation, of suffering, sand and thorns. Later on in that same passage, I'm talking now about 390, 400, 410, he talks about things falling into dust and nothing, fell into dust, fell into dust, fell into dust and disappear. A sort of unreality of reality. So the wilderness that is the opposite, the waste that is the opposite of civilization, is what comes down on these knights in this passage of the Holy Grail. Arthur was absent because he was standing up and doing his job. The vision came because Galahad was invited to sit in the siege, that is, seat, perilous. And his sitting in the seat as the only one who could brought the vision on. The vision was not meant for the other knights, but they swore an oath all the same. He sat in that seat because that seat was meant for him, as Merlin knew. Galahad was the only one of the knights pure enough to see the vision eventually. And at the end of the Holy Grail, Arthur does a kind of accounting. Remember, all of this tale is being told by Percival to Ambrosius. And at the end of the poem, around line 890, he says, out of those to whom the vision came, my greatest, that is Lancelot, hardly will believe he saw. Lancelot is riddled with doubt because he knows he's a sinner. He has violated his oath to his king. He has violated his oath as a knight. He has been adulterous with Guinevere. We'll come back to that. So the greatest one doesn't know what he saw. Another hath beheld it afar off, that's Percival, and leaving human wrongs to right themselves, he's become a monk, cares but to pass into the silent life, so another damaged goods. And one hath had the vision face to face, Galahad, and now his chair desires him here in vain, howsoever they may crown him otherwise. Galahad does not come back. So even the ones who've had a full or partial vision are ruined. Lancelot's riddled with self-doubt. Percival has gone off to become a monk. And whatever Galahad is doing, he's doing somewhere else. The end of the whole idyll ends with Percival saying, so spake the king, I knew not all he meant. And of course, that's not a good sign if the king is speaking and one of his best knights, a knight who saw the partial vision of the Grail, can't figure out what he's talking about. So it has taken a very dark turn. Camelot has not been destroyed, but there was an image of its destruction in that beautiful line I read. And the knights, the best knights, even ones who have seen or partly seen the vision, are nowhere to be found. Again, I'll stop for questions if you have them or comments. I'm very eager to know what you all thought of what you're reading. I will point out that there are some 41 of you, at least listed as attendees. You should know that when Michael and I are talking in the kind of green room and he starts to let people in, the little tally starts at 5 and 10 and 20 and it goes up. I feel like I'm watching the results from, one of those telethons where the numbers change. And yes, we have $500,000. We're up to 41 people. Any of you want to make a comment or ask a question before I move on?
Here, I've got one.
Great.
So, Catherine says, thank you for having us read this work. I am loving the poetry. Also, I am struck that the entire work is getting progressively darker. Tennyson moves from the coming of Arthur and three somewhat troubled stories that end well to a vision that is more and more precarious. Balin and Balan kill each other. Vivian betrays Merlin, who is caught by his own age and weakened powers. Elaine kills herself, and Lancelot and Guinevere are not even happy with each other. And now Arthur is away from court, and sworn discipline is lost. Tennyson is so very clear that the center will not be able to hold.
Yes, excellent comment. And let me say, if I can find the passage quickly, that the continued corrosive effects of the affair between Lancelot and Guinevere, and again, I'm going to talk more about that because there's so much to be said, corrupts everything. Everything flows from that. So if you look in the Holy Grail, Catherine, thank you for that summation. If you look around line 93, I'll say 89. So this is the Holy Grail, 89. And when King Arthur made his Table Round, and all men's hearts became clean for a season, surely he had thought that now the Holy Grail would come again. He's made a respectable, God-fearing cohort. In some versions of Arthur, the number of knights who sit at the round table is in the hundreds. I mean, think of Congress. Well, do me a favor, don't think of Congress. But it's just an impossibly high number. But sin broke out, that half line. The sin that broke out was the sin of Guinevere and Lancelot. There were lots of helpers. And once that's happened, people who depended on the purity of Lancelot, the purity of the queen, it mucks everything up. Elaine gets erased and killed because Lancelot can't return her love, even though he might want to, because he's illegally connected to Guinevere. Gawain, who's a kind of big kid, wants to pursue a relationship with Elaine, but she doesn't have time for him. And people like Balin and others who have used the Queen or Lancelot as a standard have their idealism destroyed. And that line, but sin broke out, reminds me, and I have a very sophisticated repertoire of cultural references, of the song from Les Mis, I Had a Dream. And when she talks about everything she imagines, she says, then it all went wrong. 4 words, just like, but sin broke out. It all went wrong. And the poignancy is she has this remarkable dream, like Merlin's dream of Camelot became real. And what happens? It all goes wrong. That's the essence of tragedy. Many reasons why, and part of the reason it's so catastrophic is because they wanted success so much. I'm going to take a pause here to say something about tragedy because it will help us in the weeks ahead. And those of you who've been to some of my Shakespeare talks somewhere will hear things repeated, but that's what happens is you invite the same guy back. So let's imagine that you have been given as an award a beautiful crystal bowl that you want to keep in the china closet that you inherited from your grandmother, but it's locked and you've forgotten where you placed the key. So you can't put it in the place of prominence. And so for the time being, you put it securely on the top of the cabinet and you vow to either find the key or have a locksmith make a new one. At the same time, the runner that you had down in the dining room in front of that china closet was rolled up to be taken to the cleaners. You went yesterday to pick it up and they've lost it, even though you have the ticket. And so the floor is bare in your dining room. And you have a daughter, and your daughter has a son who is a energetic little boy who likes to run up and down the floorboards of your dining room, jostling the china closet, which, by the way, has one short leg, which you keep meaning to have repaired, but you don't. And little Billy, Tommy, Lancelot, whatever his name is, runs, shakes the cabinet, the crystal bowl falls and shatters. And the question is, whose fault is that? Is it yours for not having the key, for not putting the crystal bowl somewhere more secure, for not fixing the leg? Is it little Billy's for running? Is it his mother for not making him more obedient? Is it for the person who lost the ticket or can't find the runner? These are not silly questions. Is it gravity? Because in the end, it's gravity that broke the bowl. If we didn't have gravity, it wouldn't have broken. Is it the preciousness of the bowl? Why isn't it made out of Tupperware? Tupperware doesn't break, but Tupperware isn't precious. It's the preciousness, it's the fragility, it's the vulnerability of this very dear thing that makes it a tragedy. Is it your fault because you care too much about material things? None of this is a joke. These are the kinds of questions you can ask about Romeo and Juliet or King Lear. And what makes it tragic is something precious has been lost, but it's not clear exactly who or what is responsible, even though there are people who are not guiltless. Every tragic hero is not just sinned against, but also sinning. But the key to tragedy is you cannot do the math and assign blame because the nexus, the knot of human life, is too complicated to be extricated. Tragedy has to have some good, and we'll talk at the end of the poem about what might have come out of the good of this 12 idle poem. It has to have some good, but the good does not erase the debt. So if you say, well, in Romeo and Juliet, an awful lot of people die, most of them innocent, but the two warring families have promised not to feud anymore. So does one offset the other? No. There's no way to do the math. There's no way to balance the record on the backs of the many people, most of them innocent, who have died. Hamlet has finally done what his father asked him to do 4 acts earlier and killed the king, the new king, Claudius. And he's done the right thing. But there also a number of people have died. It's good that the villain has been killed and the kingdom has been restored to some order, but at what cost? And you could make the same argument about Othello, Macbeth, and so on. In this poem, it's not just that Guinevere and Lancelot did a bad thing. Sin broke out as if the creation of Camelot was a kind of overlay of something that was just waiting to burst forth. The late 19th century, Tennyson finished his poem in the 1880s, saw the rise of the symbolist movement. And at the beginning of the 19th century, especially in Europe, I'll say in England, since we're in England, one of the things that the Romantics discovered is two opposite poles. One, that everyday things, children, daffodils, village idiots, I'm not making a joke, impaired people in villages, all of those were equally worthy of poetic attention, a kind of democratizing of the common person. At the same time, there was a glorification of the supernatural, of imagination, of Kubla Khan, of the imagined rather than just the seen. And that was another, it's what we mean when we talk about romantic. Oh, that's so romantic, high ideals. By the end of the century, especially in France, a group of writers and intellectuals, especially poets, were more and more fascinated by the later half of that, by the fact that the imagination can create its own reality. And they were known as the symbolist movement because they thought that the symbol-making power of the human mind, the poetic imagination of the human mind, was the high ideal of art. And one of their number, as I sit here now, because I didn't know I was going to be talking about this, I can't remember who, but I'll find out, said, God made everything out of nothing, but the nothingness shows through. That is a great line. It may not comfort you on a cold winter night, but it's up there with, but sin broke out. God made everything out of nothing, but the nothingness shows through. To the symbolists, one of the great images of human life was what they called the abyss, capital A, abyss. That over the reality of degradation, degeneration, damnation, not necessarily religious, sometimes just biological or imaginative, things run down, sin will break out, it will all go wrong. That's the nature of life. Over that, there's a thin patina of civilization. There's a crust, that's the image they used, that we are moving on. And even when we are joyous and dancing on that thin crust that's pulled tight over the abyss, capital A, abyss of the world, we know that it might fall through. God made everything out of nothing, but the nothingness shows through. That's the symbolist, pessimistic, fin de siècle, the phrase in France, end of the century pessimism. You get a writer like Leonard Cohen, who is not a pessimist, and he talks about the fact that the chinks in creation, the gaps in creation, is where the light comes in. Just the opposite of the symbolist. He's looking up and imagining a powerful, positive power on the other side of a dome that has its fissures. And the symbolists think that they're dancing on a grave. This poem is in the cast of that abyss, that sin will break out, that it will all go wrong, that stuff happens. So I'll take another pause in case this has engendered any questions on your part.
Well, we've had a few developing as you've been talking. I'll just do them in order because they're all pretty interesting. Why is wilderness considered so negative in Victorian times?
So first of all, it's not so much that it's considered negative in Victorian times, it's considered negative in Mallory's time, because the late Middle Ages is trying to embrace a Renaissance, which is taking place in cities of culture and civilization, and the wilderness is the opposite of that. It is considered negatively for the same reason that in Puritan New England, people were scared blankless about the woods, about what would happen in the forest where the wilderness is. What happens when you go into the woods? Ask Stephen Sondheim. It's not good if you're outside of a Broadway musical. If your value in Mallory's time is to create a myth for a nation that's just coming into the modern age, the 16th century, you are going to extol the civilized and you're going to be wary of the wilderness. It's not a Victorian notion. It's a late medieval, early Renaissance notion.
Got it. So Patricia is asking, where does Tennyson's sympathy lie? He attributes the collapse of Camelot to Guinevere's infidelity, but does Tennyson see a great romance here that makes the disaster worth it?
I think he resists that notion. Guinevere was a late arrival to the myth of Arthur, coming around the 11th or 12th century, and the courtly poets, the Provençal poets of France, and the creation of courtly love, which I'm going to speak about before we part company, did a lot to give Guinevere more traction. He's not interested in that love story from a romantic point of view. He is trying to write a cautionary tale as an aristocrat to a country that is becoming less and less aristocratic, more and more democratic. That is to say, more and more white men can vote, even though they don't own property. There's nothing democratic in the American sense, what we used to think of as democracy, in Victorian England. He is writing as a cultural critic to say, mind what happens when people of high ideals have ideals that cannot possibly be maintained. You'll see more of that as we get later into the poem, but the love story as an actual love story doesn't exist for Tennyson in this poem.
Got it. So Janet is commenting that she has always admired Merlin for his ability to create magic.
Yeah.
What is your take on Merlin?
Well, that's a pretty general question.
Yeah.
So it's a long tradition that in the mythic and supernatural haze of the past, that when you're creating a king out of legend, you're going to have a world of supernature. And because they were originally pre-Christian, these Britons, it's not surprising that a magus, a mage, a wizard is part of the landscape, just as you'd expect in certain circumstances for there to be ogres and jesters. So Merlin and his magic represents the wisdom of the power that no mere mortal can have. King Arthur is extraordinary. He pulls Excalibur out of the stone, but even he cannot delay, certainly not stop, the downward spiral of his kingdom. Merlin is a great figure, a musician, a mathematician, a mage. The relationship in the Middle Ages between music and math was very strong. He is a medicine man, and we would call him in another context. That's very common, that there be somebody who is not meant to rule, but meant to advise, to guide.
Got it. So Celia is asking, is this, meaning the poem, similar in some way to your point in the Utopia series, that humans cannot get to utopia as a statement on the human condition, and that perhaps seeking it is the problem?
Yeah. Who was that, Cynthia?
Celia.
Celia. Yeah, Celia. Sorry for misremembering your name. Well done. And I'm always happy when people connect one of my courses to another. I wish my undergraduates did it more often. Yes, this is Tennyson's point exactly. You know, the Victorians had the great exhibition in the middle of the century to show off all their technology. They thought that they were the pinnacle of the Western world. They were certainly the empire to be dealt with. And Tennyson felt strongly that pride cometh before a fall, and that the loss of humility, the tendency of some people thinking that God was actually dead, as Nietzsche is going to say at the end of the century, and he says it in German, which is much more forceful, Gott ist tot, that people are going to replace things and power and imperialism and technology for religious belief and humility. And he was enough of a Christian, at least in name, and he was enough of an aristocrat. Please remember, he's a baron. He's not like Dickens, writing as someone who came up poor. He is a poet laureate, a wealthy man. He is a member of parliament. And he is writing this to say, if you aim too high, you will fall low. There's something overweening pride in what you do. That was Satan's problem. The original sin was not the killing of Cain by Abel. It was the revolt of Satan, of Lucifer, to become Satan, because he wanted more. And if you know the movie with Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, that is a comic treatment of the Faust legend. And again, if I knew I was going to say this, I'd know the title. Maybe somebody who knows this movie. Bedazzled. Bedazzled is the movie. So Peter Cook is trying to win the soul of Dudley Moore. You may know those actors, one tall, one short. They were a comic team, a splendid team of Cook and Moore in the 50s and 60s. Dudley Moore went on to a Hollywood career of comic movies. Peter Cook did not. Peter Cook is Lucifer, explaining what he did to oppose God in heaven. And Dudley Moore, the short, more comic one, says, I don't understand. You had it great. You were in heaven. Why would you possibly revolt? And Peter Cook says, here, I'm going to stand on this garbage can. I think it's a garbage can. And you, shorter, that's important visually, Dudley Moore, run around this can where I'm standing and flap your arms like wings and say, Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest, and keep doing that. And Dudley Moore does that for a few minutes, and then he stops, he's tired. And Peter Cook says, no, keep doing it. And he does it another few times. And then finally, exhausted, Dudley Moore says, can't we change places? And Peter Cook said, that's what I said. Ba-bum. That idea of revolt is a sin, but the sin of the Victorians, from Tennyson's point of view, is not to believe anymore, is to replace the values of civilization, which can be empire and technology, use those to replace humility and earnestness and duty. So I only have a few more minutes. I want to say something about courtly love, and I can be brief. I think I mentioned this last time. Courtly love in its ideal state, which is probably more literary than factual, was the devotion of a man of talent, almost always a knight, who would dedicate his life, his exploits, to a woman, almost always married and unattainable, in order to be ennobled by his service to her. It was courtly. You need a court for courtly love. And the idea was that it was pure in the sense that you weren't doing it for sex. You weren't doing it for intimacy. You were doing it so that the female values, whatever they might be to any particular culture, would give its tincture to the male exploits of marauding and killing and so on. It was meant to be a civilizing force. Now, in some legends, Guinevere and Lancelot are in a courtly love relationship, but not in most of them. Sin broke out, and it's clear from Tennyson's poem that they have had what my foster mother used to call carnal knowledge of each other. They have actually committed adultery. That's a sin that's broken out. Until that's discovered, all the other people who see how close they are think that they're seeing courtly love enacted. Courtly love came into being at the end of 11th century as a literary tradition, as the French troubadours were adding their 2 cents to trying to make a higher civilization. And what could be higher than having a powerful, able, devoted man give his energy to the adoration of a married, unattainable, but a valuable woman. And it was pure, I have the strength of 10 because my heart is pure, is in this poem. Now, for many people, it never existed. For many people, including Lancelot and Guinevere, not that they were actually people, they couldn't keep up the ideal. But the idea that you weren't acting as a biological person, much less an animal, you were acting with an ideal, made you civilized, made you sophisticated in the best sense. Some scholars believe that it was an attempt to offset the dark Germanic morality of the Goths, and that women do not do very well in Goth culture. Unfortunately, women don't do very well in much culture in the Middle Ages, but the Germanic invaders had no room for women, for femininity, whatever that might be, for women's culture. And what the French troubadours were trying to do was try to wrest femininity and the female ideal from the Virgin Mary and the Roman Catholic Church. Because the problem with the Roman Catholic Church is it was inimical to the creation of nations. It wanted one culture. And these different nations, I mentioned this in my first meeting, wanted to come into their own right. And one of the things they had to do was to define a culture. And historians more knowledgeable than I believe that one of the things courtly love did is it took the female ideal, removed it from sex on the one side and from the veneration of a virgin on the other, and it placed it squarely in the world that these courtly residents knew, men of action and women of goodness who would not betray their husband because this was an open secret. Lancelot is sweet on me, but only in the courtly love sense. How much of it was just a literary creation, how much of it actually happened is unclear, but it's true that the writers put it forth as an ideal, that it was a self-image, that culture would include men being chivalric. And the way you did that was through a courtesy. The word court is in courtesy. It's for high-minded people of a certain class. And Tennyson's argument implicitly in the poem is that England is now ignoring that class. It is becoming more and more interested in the denizens of cities. I'll let this be my last comment. Matthew Arnold a great poet and cultural critic, wrote a series of pamphlets that were combined into a book called Culture and Anarchy, I think in the 1860s. I think that's right. And in it, he argued not about culture and anarchy, but culture or anarchy. His argument was that as England moved more and more to democracy, remember, a very, very weak version of democracy, as it was allowing people who didn't have public school education at Eton and Cambridge and Oxford, as it was letting people who didn't have heritage, who didn't have uh, a property vote. His question was, who's going to teach them who they should vote for? If an Englishman, again, white Englishman only, can vote for anybody he wants, women didn't get the vote for a long time, but they didn't in America either, barely over 100 years ago. Who's going to tell them who they should vote for? That was the issue of fascism. If you let the average person run the country by voting, who's going to tell them? Well, you need a strong leader. I'm not talking about contemporary politics. You need a duque. You need someone who will bind all the twigs of individual people into a big batch. That's what fascism means, a bundle of twigs. And Arnold said, if you're going to let people without education, without background, without breeding, without property vote, what are you going to do to prevent anarchy? You had to teach them culture. You had to tell them how to read poetry and novels and be humanists. Until the late 19th century, the poetry lecture at Cambridge and Oxford was in Latin. Nobody was reading Wordsworth in the university. They were reading the great classicists. But as the world became more and more democratic, as people like Tennyson, an aristocrat truly, and Matthew Arnold, an aristocrat by nature, are trying to think, how do we save these people from themselves? The answer was education, to try to give them enough culture to do the right thing, make the right choice. It was such a big problem that the phrase used in giving more white men the vote was shooting Niagara, like going over Niagara in a barrel. And that's the culture, that's the society that Tennyson's addressing. I'll stop there. That was covering a lot of terrain, but I hope you find it as fascinating as I do. And next time we move on to a couple that is meant to be in Peleus and Attar, a parody, a dark parody of a courtly love of a Guinevere and Lancelot coupling. So see you then.
Great, thanks, Mark. Thanks, everybody. There are one or two leftover questions at the end, so I just want to remind everybody that Mark's very happy to have you send him an email, and he'll answer your question or engage with your comments. He's happy to do that. If you don't have his email, and if you don't have his email address, shoot me an email. I'll just send his email address right back to you. And the only other thing, which is not a question, is Gene looked up your quote about nothingness showing through, and it was Paul Valery.
Yes, Paul Valery. Thank you. Gene, you did that?
Gene, yeah.
I'm very grateful. Right. Paul Valery, I should have remembered. Yes, it's a terrific quote. You don't have to agree with it to feel the force of it. Thank you. Thank you, Gene.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
And thank you, Michael, as always. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Good evening, everybody.